Hello, and welcome to this F-Secure global webcast on mobile malware. My name is Janne Kauhanen, and I will be your host today, presenting today's lineup, which consists of Mikko Hyppönen taking us through the malware cases of his long career. We'll have white hat hacker Laura taking the criminal's point of view, and our brand new CTO Christine giving us the current lay of the land in mobile malware. But first up, here's Mikko talking about the past, present, and future of mobile malware.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Indeed, my name is Mikko, and when we think about the mobile malware history and what got us to this point, that's something we've been following very closely within F-Secure. We've been doing quite a bit of work around the research starting from late 1990s, or actually almost from the mid-1990s. Well, we have to remember that F-Secure is coming from Finland, and Finland with Nokia history has always been very active in mobile handsets, mobile devices, and today mobile communication gear altogether. We started shipping our first purpose-built security solutions for mobile devices around 2002, which was, in hindsight, way too early because the very first mobile malware was found in 2004. So we had research personnel looking at potential threats and simulating what might be happening with the handsets of the time and coming up with different solutions for problems which could one day appear. And we were doing that for a couple of years before the problems actually appeared for real. But when they did appear, they were pretty much what we were expecting. And what we were expecting were Bluetooth worms spreading on Symbian devices. Number one manufacturer of Symbian devices at the time was Nokia, but Symbian was an operating system used by at least 6 different mobile phone manufacturers, so this was a universal problem. And of course, Nokia handsets at the time were being used all over the world. I was looking at a presentation I did 11 years ago. I was talking at Black Hat 2010, 11 years ago, about mobile malware situation at the time and about how viruses on handsets were making money by dialing faraway phone numbers. The title of my talk in Black Hat 2010 was "This Call Will Be Charged for $60,000." And in that slide set, as I was looking at my old decks, I had this diagram of the mobile malware situation 11 years ago. Now take a look at these numbers. In 2010, we had 516 known cases of mobile malware. These were still the time where we had exact counts. Today, nobody will be able to give you an exact count on how many mobile malware samples or different specimens we have because there's too many. Back then, we still knew. And as you can see from the pie chart, the vast majority of these were for Symbian devices. Number 2 was Windows, because Windows was still a player in mobile platforms at the time. This was Windows Mobile, and then later replaced by Windows Phone platform. We also had specific Java phones or Java platform, which was being run on multiple different vendors' phones. And we had the first examples of iPhone and Android malware. They already existed by 2010. Now, first iPhone came out in 2007. First Android device came out in 2008. So 3 and 2 years after the introduction of these platforms, we did have the first malware cases. However, these were really experimental and pretty theoretical at the time, although the first iPhone malware samples we ever found were actually trying to make money. Granted, they were only targeting jailbroken iPhones, but the very first malware case on iPhone, the second case was already a banking Trojan targeting a Dutch bank trying to steal money as people were doing online banking on their iPhones. So this wasn't just proof of concepts, they were actual real cases. In the early years of mobile malware problems, we have a great success story on how to stop whole classes of malware attacks. Now, we've seen in malware history many examples of where the prominent or one of the most common types of malware problems have been completely killed by the manufacturers making changes in the platform. Good example outside of the mobile malware area would be macroviruses, which were the #1 problem in the early 2000s, and then effectively Microsoft killed them by turning off macros by default, or prompting users to enable macros, which wasn't the norm. And that change dropped macroviruses of the time from the #1 spot on prevalence lists to further down on the lists. The same thing effectively happened with mobile malware. You see, early Bluetooth viruses like Kabir and ComWarrior, which is displayed here, again from my slides from 2010, these were spreading on Nokia and other Symbian handsets between handsets, beaming them from one handset to another over Bluetooth. And whenever people heard about this problem, they were confused. Why would anybody accept a Bluetooth transmission on their phone? Like if somebody's trying to beam you a virus, why do you accept it? What they didn't know was that at the time, the Bluetooth interface on Symbian phones, it was broken. Basically, if you took your phone to make a phone call and there was someone in your room or in the Bluetooth range trying to beam you an infected file, you couldn't use your phone. Your phone wouldn't let you make a phone call. It wouldn't let you do anything at all. The only option you had on your screen was, would you like to get this file, yes or no? And if you answered no, the infected handset would beam it to you immediately again, which means it looks like no doesn't work. You want to make a phone call, you can't make a phone call because there's this stupid question on your screen and no doesn't work. What do? Well, of course, some users chose yes, trying, maybe they can then make a phone call or use their phone for something else. So this was a user interface problem. And this was actually fixed in newer versions of Symbian, where they built in a cache. They remembered that you had answered no to this device already once, and they will remember that decision for 30 minutes. And that change, slight change in the logic of the user interface, killed off the whole Bluetooth worm problem. And we haven't had Bluetooth worms as a real widespread problem ever since. But for a short period in history, they were the biggest problem on handsets, and they were really spreading in the real world. I actually got samples beamed to my Symbian handsets in 3 different countries during 2004 and 2005. So we were very close to a real problem, but the platform changed quickly enough to handle this. Also, Symbian introduced Symbian signed process, so applications started to come closer to where we are today, meaning that the applications can only be downloaded from certain places, which brings you built-in security. But when we look at the platforms as a whole, again, from my 2010 slide sets, I found this diagram really interesting. Like back then, we had 3 dominant operating systems on your computers and 3 dominant operating systems on your handsets. You were either running Windows or Mac or Linux. On your computer, you were running Windows, Mac, or Linux. On your phone, you were running Windows, Mac, or Linux. Linux, of course, is Android. Interestingly enough, the malware platforms were the exact opposites of each other. Like on the computer side, of course, malware is, and still today, is mostly a Windows problem, unless we think about IoT malware, which is a Linux problem. But if you think about desktop computers, then it's going to be a Windows problem, pretty much only. And then when we look at the mobile side, well, Windows is no longer a player there, but clearly it is a Linux, aka Android problem. That's when we speak about malware. However, mobile problems are not just about malware. When we think about mobile security as a whole, we can look at this from many different angles. Many people think that these mobile devices, whether they're tablets or mobile phones, are sort of like, toys. Like they're not real computers. And of course, they are not as secure as real computers. And that's actually incorrect. They are real computers for all practical purposes, and in many ways they are much, much superior in security to traditional computer operating systems because they are much newer. They are much newer, use newer technology, and are much more restrictive. However, it's quite easy to lose one of these. If you think about security, you have to remember that you're not likely to leave your laptop behind in a taxi, but you do leave your phone behind in a taxi regularly. So physical security is much harder to handle with these cases. Phishing might be a much bigger problem on handsets, like on mobile phone handsets, than on your computers, just because it's harder to see the URLs. There's less room to show the full URL in the address browser bar, and it's becoming really small to read it. It's maybe harder to fool users to go to misleading URLs on your computer than on a phone. And then we have the fact of apps. The app stores and Google Plays are filled with free applications, and as we know, there is no free lunch. The free apps make money somehow, and that, as we know pretty well by now, is mostly fueled by profiling the users, creating information about the users, how they use their devices, try to gain access to their address books, to the location information, to photos, and so on. Now, if you look at the different ad kits or SDKs which are available for mobile platforms, it's pretty scary what kind of information they try to collect about users, like sexual orientation or marital status, based on many different indicators they're able to collect from these phones. And this isn't malware in traditional sense. This is profiling of the users. These are official approved applications which are trying to gather as much information about the user through the handset use as possible. One more point about how mobile handsets have become real computers. Just looking at the usage rates. When we look at the websites, the biggest websites in the world, and the traffic they are getting, last year 68% of that traffic was coming from mobile phones, 29% coming from real computers. So the web is mobile. The web is mobile. Most of your users, the vast majority of your users are mobile. 3% use tablets, 29% use computers, 68% use phones to go to the biggest websites in the world. Then when we look at processing power, well, today's mobile phones are supercomputers. Today's mobile phones are supercomputers. For all practical purposes, they have the processing power of what we just a couple of years ago would have called a supercomputer. In fact, many modern mobile phones are faster than today's laptops, which is ridiculous, but it's also true. This is where we are today. But I think most importantly, from our point of view, mobile devices are a massive success story for security. Just think about iPhone. iPhone released in 2007, which has now 20% or 18% of the mobile market share and is one of the most commonly seen mobile devices. Since 2007, we haven't seen a single mobile malware outbreak on iPhone. And when I say outbreak, I mean something which would actually be spreading and infecting real users in the real world in large scale. That has never happened. Even on Android, the outbreaks we've seen have been very small compared to what we see on computer platforms. And that's a huge success story. And that's because the architecture of these devices is pretty much the same architecture as we have in our games consoles. The architecture of this device is the same as you have in PlayStation or Xbox. I'm not speaking about the operating system. I'm speaking about the idea that they are computer. Like this is a computer. An Xbox is a computer. But it's the kind of computer which you, the owner of that computer, does not have a right to program. If you have an Xbox which is running Windows, even if you're a programmer, you can't write your own programs for your goddamn Xbox. Same thing here. I own this phone. I'd love to write programs for it, but I don't have the permission to do that. Apple has denied me the right to program this. The only way I could write programs for my own device is that I would write a program, send it to be approved to Apple. And then if Apple would approve it, then I could get the certificates and signings and the rights to run it on my own device. This is a very restrictive model, but it is also a very secure model. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikko, for that very interesting take on the mobile platforms. And I guess, given the prevalence and importance of these devices, I think we'll next need Laura to give us the criminals' point of view, how the criminals approach these devices that we carry with us. Laura.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and welcome also on my behalf. Today I wanted to talk about what Mikko just now touched. So how would we actually get this type of malware on a phone? So when we look at our mobile phones, it has more than just the phone itself. It has a lot of attack surface from the criminal's point of view. It has all sorts of applications. It has your phone. It has text messages. There are many ways we could get inside of your phone, or inside of your accounts at least. And Christine will talk more about those after me. But if we just look at malware specifically, and malware targeted at mobile phones. If you've ever heard on the news the word Pegasus, 0 days or zero-click hacks, which are targeted at mobile phones, aiming to get malicious code running on your phone, then after that either tracking you, following you around, or stealing your information, that is a real issue. Those kinds of things actually exist. So it's not as if there would be no malware existing for Android or iOS today. It's just the scale of things. And let me just go through, for example, the payment model for the top most wanted vulnerabilities for iOS and Android. So Zerodium, if you've never heard of Zerodium, it's a place where you can sell your 0 days. So if you, as a hacker, criminal, you find a vulnerability, it actually doesn't make a lot of sense for you personally to exploit that in a mass scale if you are an individual criminal working there. So if you happen to stumble upon, for example, a full persistence malware for an iOS or Android, you can get paid up to $2 million or $2,005,000 for submitting that malware, or that vulnerability, to Zerodium. And Zerodium then can sell it forward. But what I'm getting at here is that if you, as a criminal, or if you were a criminal and found this kind of vulnerability, it actually makes a lot of sense not to use it yourself, but to sell it to someone who will use it to a very targeted group of people. For example, activists, journalists, or other people of interest. So if we go back to being just a normal criminal, just wanting to make a buck with mobile malware, there's one big thing that we need to deal with. And Mikko already mentioned actually the fact that our phones are just computers, but they are a little bit more secure than a normal computer would be. And that's mainly due to the reason that the permission model is set up on our phones. So instead of all applications kind of residing in the same box they are, you could think of them as being in their own boxes with their own restricted privileges and with their own restricted access to their own data. Now, in addition to their own privileged box, not privileged, they're just boxes, they have the possibility of asking more accesses. So they can ask for access to your camera, to your photos, and the shared functionalities within your phone. So basically, whenever you download an application that wants to use your camera, wants to look at your photos, wants to see your text messages or anything, they need to prompt you for access. And this is what these Zerodium level 0 days try to get past, so that they wouldn't need to require to ask you for access. So they would be able to basically just elevate the privileges on your phone and gain full access to your phone. But in normal scenarios, these would require and in these these Zerodium kinds of 0 days as well, what they require is something called jailbreaking for iPhone or rooting for Android, which means that you're escalating the normal privileges inside of the phone. So after that, you wouldn't need to actually think of this permission model anymore. It wouldn't be of any hindrance to you. But as a petty criminal, this is one of the biggest things that you need to deal with when targeting Android or iOS phones. And Android and iOS phones, they are quite different as well when it comes to how they function and how their ecosystems are laid out. iOS is relatively closed off from external code, from external access. So for example, the official store where you can install applications is quite well monitored, and it's really hard to get custom code run inside of your iOS device unless it's jailbroken. But by default, a normal user wouldn't even jailbreak their phone. It's a very specific operation that requires very specific steps. So this is a little bit different when we talk about Android. Android allows something called sideloading, for example. So you can get applications from non-official Play Store, and you can get custom things running on your phone much easier. So if we think about, and from attacker point of view, it would make a lot more sense to perhaps target Android instead of iOS, unless we want to go through the problem of finding the 0 days, and in which case it would be even better to sell them forward. Even Android naturally has the insight and look into applications that are directly downloaded into these official app stores. But by default, as Android was designed, it was designed to be more open for customization and more open for different types of apps. So that's why it has left the support for external loading or side loading for applications. So anything that comes out of Google Play Store may or may not have gone through any kind of security check, and especially if you download it from any random website, it probably has not gone through any kind of security check, and probably someone has planted it there on purpose. There are many places where you can download applications outside of Play Store, either through other APK stores or download places or websites. And in there, one of the things that as a criminal you could try to play with is that you use a well-known brand and you slip your own application in there, pretending to be something else or someone else than you're actually are. And this is just one example of Google Chrome for phone, which is from some random developer somewhere, so it's no way affiliated with Google, for example. So you really need to be careful when you are downloading these kinds of applications outside of the official stores. So now from attacker point of view, what we need to do next is that we basically write the malware application. So there are plenty of readily made applications or APKs, these download packages that you can just use for your own purposes, or you could then go through a little bit more trouble and write your own malware. But basically, after you've written your malware, you package it and place it in one of these stores, or then on your own website and lure someone there and try to get them to download it. And once they download your application, it will be the user or your user, whoever downloads your malware, will be prompted with selections for allowing access to their text messages, to their location, or whichever functionality you want to access. Typically, one of the things that malware want to access is something called accessibility features, which allows, for example, accessing the screen, reading whatever is on the screen, and things like these. And typically, especially for newer Android phones, it will separately prompt you for this specific access right, that this is dangerous, you shouldn't use this. But in one way or another, the criminals will try to lure you in and get you to download it. Now, once you have downloaded the application, there are several possibilities that the application can do. It can steal your data. It can try to read your information. It can install scareware, which is basically just ads popping up telling that you're infected, asking you to download more stuff or give out your information, or scaring you into thinking that you have ransomware, or actual ransomware that encrypts your data. Or then it can start to spam text messages to your contacts on your contact list, for example. So there are possibilities for attackers to play with the features on your phone once they get in. The best way to protect yourself from these types of attacks is to keep your phone clean. And this means that download applications only from places where you know that they should be downloaded from. And also keep your phone updated. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Laura. And last we have our CTO, Christine, giving us the big picture of the mobile threat landscape, what's happening in the bad world of mobiles. Christine.
All right, thank you, Janne. And hello to everyone who's joining us in here today. Now, my colleagues Mikko and Laura have already mentioned about the evolution of the threats in the mobile landscape, as well as some of the attacks that are happening there. And I do hope that this has given us an appreciation, or at least the need for thinking of how much we need to protect this platform. Because think about it. What is the closest relationship that you may have today aside from your partner, your children, or your parents? For some of us, it's probably our mobile phones, and it's a very intimate relationship. For some of us, I'm not saying all, sometimes we go to bed beside it, and it's the first thing on our hands when we wake up in the morning, and perhaps even the last thing we look at, even we go to sleep at night. Now, I'm not qualified to comment whether this is good for our mental health or not, but suffice to say that for a platform that's always connected, always on, and almost always within inches of our physical bodies, we need to be thinking about how to keep ourselves safe when we are with this platform. Today, I'm going to be discussing some of the examples of these 6 different threats that we have seen in the mobile landscape. And while this is not comprehensive of all the threats that we have out there, it's still the largest volumes of the threats that we have seen. So let's start with malicious apps. Now, we have already seen, like mentioned earlier with Mikko as well as Laura, that although the volume of apps in this Android platform is not as high as desktops, they are still having some malicious apps, especially Android. And we have actually seen that in the past year, so even coming from last year, the volume of malicious apps that we have detected in our Android endpoint protection has been steadily increasing. And this has included, so for example, some adware that are made to actually display ads on your phone and monetize from that, as well as some of the apps who perform something that the user may not be aware of what they're doing, for example, reading SMS messages or installing banking Trojans, perhaps. And in the past 30 days, so you have probably seen earlier that Laura was showing about the app that was called Chrome. And in the past 30 days, we have seen that these 3 different texts can be found in the top applications that we have detected. So 59% of the malicious Android apps have the text voicemail or Chrome or video player. So we need to think about this, that typically these apps are pushed via messages. We don't look for them in the app stores. When they are pushed and you try to install them and they have these names, they are most likely malicious and we should avoid them. One of the apps that we have seen going around Europe since April this year is Flubot. And since April up until August, this has actually been steadily increasing in our telemetry. And even now in September, when we are only halfway through September, this is already on the same volume as it was last July. Now, how is Flubot spreading and why is it spreading like this? Well, firstly, Flubot arrives via SMS, so an SMS message. So it's not typical that people look for Flubot in the App Store. And when this arrives, Flubot will request that the user will install or activate accessibility services, so accessibility capabilities that Laura has also mentioned earlier. And when it comes to these accessibility services that the user needs to turn on, this is actually quite useful if you yourself, for example, have a disability and you need assistance in using your mobile phone. Because this is quite powerful, these capabilities. So for example, if this is turned on, this enables an app the right to read what is the text inputted into another app. So it can log keystrokes, for instance. It can read SMS messages. And in the case of Flubot, it can read contact information and then send that to the attacker. And the attacker can perform further sending of SMS messages or use those contacts for future purposes. And Flubot is also able to perform overlays. Now, overlays are supposed to be already gone for standard applications as of Android 10 or Android Q. But unfortunately, if you have turned on accessibility services, then this capability comes back, and it's useful when an app has that capability. And overlays are actually quite tricky, because think about it. If you have a regular banking app, and then there is a malicious app that is overlaid, like on top of the regular banking app, and there is only one area in there that is interactive, and that's the part where you input credentials. So as far as the user is concerned, whenever he or she looks at the app, it looks like it's the banking app, but apparently it's already the overlaid app on top of the banking app. So the credentials don't go into the banking app, they go towards the attacker. And this is why accessibility services are quite tricky. So the advice here is that if you don't need these accessibility permissions, please don't enable it, especially if the application requesting is the one that's being pushed to you, and you didn't really look for these applications in the Play Store, for instance. Another threat that Mikko has also mentioned earlier is phishing. And here is one example of what kind of phishing is happening on a mobile platform, and this is SMS phishing or smishing. I actually received this a few weeks back, and it pretended to be coming from one of the more popular supermarket chains in Finland, K-Market. And then it told me that I won something. And if I clicked on the link, apparently I won an iPhone 12. And if I click on it further, then it will ask for my name and my credit card information. And think about it, SMS is not the only messaging application that you will have in your phone. You have WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, etc. So there are different ways to perform phishing using messages on one's phone. And since your mobile phone is, well, a phone, there is also such a thing as voice phishing or vishing, where somebody could give you a call and then request for credentials using that, or perhaps even pretend to be from technical support and then ask the target to install a remote access tool on their device, and then try to access further information from your desktop device, for instance. And here we have a platform that has several names for different types of phishing. You can imagine how much widespread actually phishing is on this type of platform. Another threat that we have seen mostly on iPhones this time is this calendar spam. And this is happening via ICS files or iCalendar files, which is actually the de facto method for trying to schedule events or trying to schedule meetings in the Apple platforms. But this can also be used to subscribe to calendars. And for example, if you have a message such as this one on the screen where somebody sent you a message to subscribe to a calendar, and it's actually a spammy calendar, then your calendar could look like this, which actually renders your calendar pretty useless. And even if you open some of these meetings, supposedly you will see that there are some links that are actually quite malicious, or they go into scams. And how easy is it for attackers to create such subscriptionable calendars? Well, there are open source tools that are available in order to do this. There's also some legitimate uses for this, but of course, this can be misused for these malicious purposes as well. So suffice to say, this is quite an accessible way of performing these malicious activities. Now, if any of you have any problems already with spammy calendars, there is, of course, hope. You can unsubscribe to those spammy calendars using your calendar app. Now, we have talked about overlays, overlay issues in Androids, as well as spammy calendars in iPhones. But there are also equal opportunity threats out there, and these are vulnerabilities, and especially vulnerabilities in messaging apps. And Laura has showed us earlier that there are very high payouts for zero-click exploitations of vulnerabilities, and those happen when sometimes a message comes in or a call comes in to any of these messaging apps, and that's all it takes for the exploit to actually arrive in the system and execute and deliver the payload. And there are also other exploitations that the message would need to arrive and then you open it, and that's when the payload actually executes. And although this sounds quite scary, and that's why it makes it to mainstream media, this is not happening very widely, because as Laura also showed this earlier, there is also an area here where there is bounty being assigned to exploits for these messaging apps. So there are different messaging apps represented here. You can have Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, iMessage, etc. And the bounties could range from $500,000 to $1.5 million. So if you are a random threat actor who creates your own banking Trojan and you would like to monetize it, you will most likely not use this kind of exploitations for your own banking Trojan, because the alternative to just selling your exploit is quite lucrative. And that is unless you're the NSO group. So for example, and your governments are your clients, and the use cases are cyber espionage, then suddenly those types of costs are not really that costly anymore. And this is why we have also seen in mainstream media that these have been the go-to favored method when it comes to deploying spyware, for instance, because they needed to deploy spyware remotely. And using these capabilities, there is a way to execute code remotely and then deploy the spyware to, for example, journalists and activists, as Laura has also touched upon earlier. But there is a threat where it looks like spyware and it acts like spyware. It can read SMS messages, for instance. It can eavesdrop upon your calls. That is much, much closer to home than this type of spyware. And I'm talking about Stalkerware. And in the past 2 years, we have also seen that the volume of Stalkerware that have been detected in our endpoint protection telemetry have been steadily going up. And the type of Stalkerware that we see here have capabilities like pinpointing your exact location, like exact location of your device, wherever that is. It's also able to read SMS messages. It's able to take pictures, for example, or videos from your camera, as well as record conversations. And most of this, as we have seen since the start of this year, can be found, for instance, in Google Play. So out of the 152 different packages that we have detected since January of this year, only 3 of them comprise 64% of the volume of detections. And those top 3 Stalkerware or trackingware can be found in Google Play. So these are the 3 ones. But it doesn't mean that that is the only place where you can find this, because Laura was mentioning side loading earlier, and there are other applications that cannot be found in Google Play that can also be installed on your phone. And there's more of them, and some of these Stalkerware have way more capabilities as well. And even if you're using an iPhone, for instance, you're in the iOS platform, there are also options to perform tracking that can be found, for example, such as mLite. And going back to the Android platform, so the types of Stalkerware that we have seen, we tried to look at what are the permissions that they get, the top permissions that they wanted to have for your phone. So firstly, they wanted to be able to access photos and videos. They wanted to be able to see what are the files that you have in your device, and 87% of them wanted to do that. 86% of them also want to access where the device is, like precisely at any given time, to track where the device is and effectively where you are. And then 79% of them would like to have access to the camera in order to perform pictures and videos. And then finally, 72% of them would like access to record audio so that, for instance, they can listen to phone call. So of course, nobody wants to be spied upon. So how do you know if you have a Stalkerware in your device? Well, for one, Stalkerware is a very permission-hungry application. So if you are looking at your device and if you check what apps you have in your device and you see an app that looks like this, it has access to your camera, to your contacts, to your SMS, to your microphone. Why would an app need that much access? So this is probably the time when you should get very, very suspicious at this app, especially if you have a name like Wi-Fi. And then if you try to uninstall it, then it asks you for a password and you yourself didn't install this app. And then for instance, if you have this app as a device admin, I mean, if somebody gave permission to this app to be a device admin and it can erase all data, it can lock the screen, disable the cameras, that is probably too much rights and privileges that you have given to the app, and this should be deactivated. So with all of these threats that we are seeing nowadays, what are we to do? Well, firstly, if you have a device that is always within inches of you, perhaps we should know what's inside it periodically. Like just check, it's basic hygiene to check what are the apps that we have installed, that perhaps there are already suspicious apps in there, and to uninstall them, or perhaps if you cannot uninstall them in normal mode, then boot your Android phone in safe mode and uninstall those applications. Because there's a lot of times that these side-loaded applications can actually be removed during safe mode. And it's just basic hygiene, because it's not only that the malicious apps that we should care about, because if you have apps that you no longer use, for example, it's a messaging app, or it's an app that's quite hungry for some of the resources of your phone, then it's just basic hygiene. It makes your phone more performant as well, and it lessens the attack surface on your phone. And the next thing is that we receive messages in different apps on our phone. If you are already suspicious of the message that arrived, probably there's no need to read it. You can just clear it or delete it. And if you really must check what's inside, then it's probably better not to click on that link or even install an app coming from a link that is pushed to you. Because typically, how do you look for an app? You usually go to the marketplace and then try to get the app from there. And then thirdly, a lot of the developers of these applications actually do their due diligence, including the developers of the operating system, that whenever there's a vulnerability, they do try to patch them as quickly as they can. So let's keep our phones and the apps inside on the latest versions. And finally, whenever we perform cybersecurity awareness trainings, let's make sure that people understand that the phones that they are carrying are included as an interface when it comes to these attack vectors. Because sometimes people only think about their desktop computers and not really think that their phones are an attack vector as well. Since we are carrying this thing every single day, let's make sure that this continues to be our ally and doesn't get used against us. Thank you so much for listening. I'll now call in Mikko and Laura to join me so that we can answer your questions.
And we do have a whole bunch of questions for you guys, and
Okay.
I think we're going to start with a softball. The age-old question, Android versus iOS. Currently, it looks like iOS vulns are selling for less, for example, in Zerodium. Does that mean that iOS is now less secure than Android?
In practice, iOS is superior. Like if you're running an iPhone or iPad device, the likelihood of getting hit by something is vastly lower than getting hit by Android malware. It doesn't say much about how difficult it is or how valuable the exploits are. It really is a question of market shares and the practical exploitability of these devices. If you look around for security experts and look at what devices they are running themselves, you'll see that most of them are running iPhones, and there is a reason for that.
Well, that was the follow-up question. What device are you guys using?
Yeah,
I have an iPhone.
same here. Yeah, and also when it comes to the prices of the exploits, naturally, as Mick also mentioned, the market share, so not everyone is using iOS, so it also reflects to the usage of the different operating systems. So the what's the basically demand for these vulnerabilities right now?
Yeah.
And then one point about, but I've also paid attention to security experts and the platforms they run themselves. Some people, me included, run multiple devices. So you might have a public phone number on a device which you might expect an attacker might be able to find your contact information and your phone number and try to exploit that. Then you might have another phone which you really don't share and which is an unknown device. And of course, that's much harder to exploit, especially if you keep Bluetooth and other connectivity, local connectivity bandwidths off on that device.
Good point. Speaking of Zerodium, why is such a company even existing in the first place? Like, how come selling and buying vulnerabilities is legal?
Well, it is legal and it is regulated in the same way that we regulate other dual-use items. So, for example, if you build parts for weapons, you can't just freely sell them to wherever. You have to get approval for those kind of things. Some of those same mechanisms apply today to exploits as well. Buying and selling exploits is not illegal. This is a legitimate business and there is a need for that. Law enforcement authorities use these to hunt down bad guys. There's a need for that kind of functionality, but clearly it very easily slips towards a scenario where those same kind of attacks can be used for legitimate citizens or against ourselves. So I guess my main call for companies that operate in the exploit business or parties that use offensive technologies is openness as much as possible. Make it clear what you're doing. Make it clear who do you sell to and who you don't sell to. And when authorities like local law enforcement uses these tools, I'd really love to see statistics on how many citizens' computers and phones you've exploited over the last 12 months and how many of those turned out to be guilty and how many of those turned out to be innocent. And as long as we don't actually see statistics like these, we, the citizens, can't really make decisions on whether this is a good idea or a bad idea.
Do you guys think it's right that security researchers, when they disclose the vulnerability responsibly, they get 700 euros and a mug, but if they sell it to Zerodium, they can make $250,000?
That's actually like very tricky, and now it's depending now on typically the ethics of the security researchers, because there are security researchers that I know that they really sell to the bounty program of the actual developer that in order to support fixing the application. But of course, there are more security researchers that I actually don't know who are most likely selling to different platforms as well. But it boils down really to the security researcher themselves as well.
Yeah. Well, we have colleagues inside F-Secure who have found 0 days from iOS and have told Apple instead of telling to a broker. And we just have to tip our hats. They, in my book, in my opinion, they made the right call. But obviously, that's only they themselves can make that decision.
Exactly. Yeah. So I guess this more for Mikko. What is the funniest mobile malware you've ever come across?
In the early days, we saw plenty of mobile malware which was playing tricks with the users. Just like in the early days of computer malware, we saw plenty of malware which was playing tricks with the users. I don't recall anything which would have been particularly funny on the mobile side, but I do remember Skulls. Skulls D, I remember, is the one which basically locked down your Symbian device and just left this flashing skull on your screen showing that your device is dead. If that's not funny, I don't know what is.
There was Skulls that was replacing the actual icon with the skull face.
Yes, yeah.
They overwrite.
That was skulls.c. So yeah, different versions of the same malware. One of them was replacing every icon on your device with a skull symbol. The other one was showing a full screen dead skull on your screen. Hilarious, I think.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
Hilarious.
All right. We had a very specific question about camera filter apps, which are very popular in some countries. Face swapping apps, sort of creating deep fakes on your mobile device. What are, like, leaving aside the implications of those for the society in general, what are the implications for the user of that app, like security concerns if you use an app like that?
Well, there's always the data collection aspect. So depending on if you paid for the app or if you didn't pay for the app. So a lot of these, for example, the apps where you can replace your face to a movie scene or these kinds of apps, they actually cost you a little bit. So those are making money from the actually you buying the application. But as Mick also mentioned before, that if something is free, then that whole company behind that application, they still need to make ends meet. So there could be a way that they are profiting out of your data. One thing you can do is to read the privacy policy of that specific application, and that's basically a contract that they are obliged to follow when it comes to handling your data.
What about could these companies be running crypto mining apps on my phone while I wait for my video or something? I don't know.
This actually has been done, but not recently. Very few of the current blockchain mining algorithms work efficiently enough on today's devices. You really would need especially purpose-built devices to do meaningful amount of mining, even if you have large amount of handsets to do it. There might be some edge cases where this still would be functional, but this used to be the case. I mean, we used to see some mining algorithms run on mobile devices 7-8 years ago. So this has been tried.
Okay. How much of an attack vector is Wi-Fi for mobile devices?
Well, there are some examples of what has happened with Wi-Fi and mobile devices. So for example, if there is a place that you frequent and you have already activated yourself to the SSID, so the access point of that Wi-Fi, if somebody pretended to be that and carried their own desktop, for instance, or any machine, then you yourself, with your phone, could automatically connect to that new location. And therefore, they now become sort of like a middleman for your data, and therefore can actually harvest your data if it flows through there. And if that's targeted, for instance, they can perform man-in-the-middle attacks and then even perform further installations of, let's say, certificates on your desktop device and then decrypt the data that's actually going out of your device. So therefore, they can snoop on you, for instance. So that's one example that we have seen.
Okay.
Yeah.
We had a question about where do these Stalkerware apps come from? Are they in regular app stores, or where do you find these?
That's a good question. So some of them are in regular app stores, but those are typically, they are not necessarily branded as, Stalkerware or used for following your spouse or ex-spouse around. They are mostly for kind of, how should I put it, like a softer use case. And there's a clear incentive from Google's side, for example, from the official stores to get these kinds of heavy-duty Stalkerware out of the stores. So what has happened is that these very heavy-duty Stalkerware that allow you to track conversations, to record audio, and these sort of things, they are typically side-loaded, so you download them outside of these stores into the phone so that they are able then to do quite powerful actions on the phone and track user behavior.
All right. What would be the nightmare scenario for mobile malware?
I think we were pretty close to one nightmare scenario around 2004, 2005, as these original Bluetooth viruses were spreading. What was still missing was that they still required user interaction. But if we imagine wireless mobile attacks spreading from one device to any other device which is close enough, automatically, without user interaction, users could be sleeping and their device would get infected, and then when they would take the infected device with them in the morning to the train, they would infect everybody in the train, they go to the workplace, all the devices around them get infected. We're speaking about the same kind of thing as pandemics are with humans, which, as we've seen, spread all too easily. Now, I think the scariest scenarios right now today, with today's technology, would be around code execution vulnerabilities in the baseband chips themselves. I'm speaking about the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi chips that we have on our devices, definitely on our phones, but also in our laptops. There's been multiple documented cases of remote code execution vulnerabilities on the chipsets themselves. So you could imagine that if someone would weaponize that and turn that into an automatic worm, that would really spread as you carry your Dell laptop or MacBook or iPhone around, and anybody within the range of these devices would automatically get infected. Now, how likely is it that we would see something like this is a different discussion. Back then in 2004, 2005, the early Bluetooth viruses on early phones they didn't really have, like ComWarrior, which I mentioned, didn't have a motive. It was just trying to spread. The author wanted to see how far it goes. You look at today's attacks, almost all of them try to make money. And if you're trying to make money, you wouldn't want to write an automatic worm which would spread around the world as quickly as possible, because the only thing that gets is it gets into headlines and becomes very public, and that's the last thing criminals want. So it's a nightmare scenario which is possible and which would be horrible, but it's also maybe unlikely, because that's not how today's attackers actually work.
All right. Well, on that encouraging note, it's time to wrap up today's session. Thank you for presenting today, and thank you for joining us today, and be sure to join us next time for our next webinar.